Honestly, I'm not 100% sure that I should be doing this, because I think probably the best way, really, for me to explain, uh, why I recommend that church above other churches. I try to look at things objectively. It's a little different for me because I was born into this church, but I'm a little different because I left this church for a lot of years, and I wasn't my personal foundation in this church wasn't like I didn't really grow up in this church. I was born into it, but I didn't grow up in it, if that makes sense. My family had a lot of turmoil, a lot of dysfunction, and because of that, we didn't attend regularly per se. We went, but it was very spotty, and we went through a lot of different things, and it's a long, complicated history, um, which would take too much time to explain, and it wouldn't be fruitful to explain all that. But just suffice to say that I didn't grow up in it, so it's not like I'm recommending to you something that is my personal culture per se. Meaning, I grew up mostly in the world, and I mean, I was born into this church, and there was times when I saw Christ, I saw Jesus in this church, and I saw the Spirit. But I left because I had a dysfunctional family, so I didn't keep attending, and I was young. I was like 12 when I left. I mean, it just gets complicated because I wasn't, um, my family wasn't attending regularly because we had a lot of problems. And also at the same time, there was some issues with some of the elders in this church in the city that I was born in. And so what happened was we moved from that city to a different city because there were some problems, um, within that church, and that church actually separated from the main line, or the main leadership. It gets complicated, but it's not as like solid and serious as you would think. Like, oh, the leadership is like, so that's not the point. Christ is the point, and what Jesus is doing is the point. But suffice to say, these leaders in the church that I was born into, meaning the city that I was born into, the place we were meeting, they sort of separated from the main leaders in different localities. So they kind of separated themselves, and because of that, my family felt that we had to move. But again, we also had our own dysfunction and our own problems in our household. My father was an alcoholic, and these type of things. So we were going through our own struggles, our own personal struggles outside of this major struggle within our church. So because of that, we didn't attend that much. And then when we moved, we sort of attended for a little while, and that's where I really started touching Jesus within the local churches, when I really started seeing something, particularly of the Spirit, right? Because it says God is Spirit, right? John 4:24, God is Spirit. Those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truthfulness. So that's a big key to understanding what God is, who God is. God is Spirit, right? So what I touched, and I experienced and I felt personally, was Christ as the Spirit. And I touched Him for the first time in Spokane, Washington. I was born in Moses Lake, Washington, moved to Spokane, Washington, because of the turmoil in Moses Lake with the leadership. And because of that, I basically grew up more or less in Spokane. I think I was 8 years or 10 years old. I think I was 10. Was I 10 or was I 8? No, I was 8 years old when I moved to Spokane. And anyway, long story short, I didn't attend that much because my father was an alcoholic, and then he left a couple years after I think it was 2 or 3 years after we moved. No, actually, I'm sorry, it was 5 years after we moved to Spokane, and so basically, I think we attended for off and on about 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then I stopped going at a certain point. And because my father was so messed up, he didn't, make me go or anything like that. And my mom was, damaged from my dad. She didn't make me go, and so I just essentially stopped going. And I didn't know anything about the world. I didn't know anything about the world, in the sense that you shared that verse where you said the world all the things in the world are opposed to God or something like that. You shared that verse, John chapter 2, right? Well, that world I didn't know anything about. Not the world in a general sense, but the satanic world, which is opposed to God. I didn't know anything about that. So when I left the church, I was essentially exposed to the world, or I was essentially, I willfully cast myself out to the world by stopping my attendance of church. So I didn't know that was even a thing. I didn't understand that. It took me like 15 years to even understand that. My stopping to go to these meetings was me turning to the world. I didn't know that for about 10 or 15 years. No, I mean essentially 15 years, because I think I was 12. I didn't know that. No, actually 10 years, because I realized what the world was, right, my early 20s. But that was when I came back into contact with the church. But I did touch something of Christ those 2 or 3 years that I attended in Spokane, and I didn't know what it was. The reason why I say this is because it gives me a good perspective. It gives me so I've had both perspectives. I'm not somebody who's just raised and grown up in this church culture and I don't know anything else, because I've met a lot of people like that in my church, in the local churches, who really were kind of sheltered in this local church bubble. I was not. I had, because of the dysfunction of my parents. My parents did not confine me to this the local church, and now it may even be which had been the practice of a lot of other parents, but now it may be somewhat different. Now maybe the parents are sort of starting to come together and realize that, well, maybe we shouldn't be too strict in letting sheltering our children in this local church bubble. They need some experience of some things outside, but there needs to be a limit. But I had no limit because my parents were dysfunctional. So I had really no fatherly parental guidance or rules or leadership. I more or less raised myself, which was pretty harsh, pretty detrimental. But the reason why I say that is because I went out to the world and I got the worldly perspective. I mean, God was there, God was protecting me, God was with me, and He kept me from ultimate damage. But I was still damaged by the world to a good extent. And it's taken me many years to kind of repair myself from that, or to allow God to repair me. And I don't know how much I've been recovered from the damage that has been done, that I experienced in the world. And some of the things still affect me. Some of the habits and practices still affect me. So that goes really deep, and it's something that's even deep as far as the church is concerned. And it's like, it's weird for me to talk about, because it's like not a lot of people understand something like that. I think it would really take a magnanimous person or a very intelligent person to understand, objectively understand what I'm talking about. And you would have to have the perspective that the world is the matrix. You would have to have the perspective that the world is satanic, and the satanic world is not good. It's not for people's benefit. It's really to just keep people occupied with things other than God. That's the essence of the world system. And we see this picture typified in the book of Exodus, right, with Pharaoh. And I'm sorry, my throat, I don't know what's going on. I need to drink some water or something, but my throat is drying up. But we see the picture of the world in the book of Exodus with Pharaoh. If you read the book of Exodus, the children of Israel were enslaved to Pharaoh, right? And the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, I think mostly the Old Testament, it speaks in types and figures. A type is typology, meaning it's almost like metaphorical. I think that's a good way to explain it. But you can Google what that word typology means, and metaphorical. You can Google what those terms mean, or not metaphor. Everybody knows what metaphorical means. Figurative, types and figures. So the Old Testament is kind of metaphorical in the sense that it uses allegories, types, and figures to sort of explain the Christian life. what the children of Israel went through in the Old Testament kind of mirrors what individual believers go through in their life in the New Testament age, which is what we're living in now. We're not living in the Old Testament times, we're living in the New Testament times. We're living in the New Testament age. Since Christ died, it became the New Testament age. So we're living in that age still. We're not living in Old Testament times. So the Old Testament is a book that's filled with types, figures, shadows, and allegories that work as metaphors to explain what the Christian life is like and walking with God. So we could take that knowledge and apply it to what we know about the Old Testament, particularly with the children of Israel, because the children of Israel were essentially God's called out people. As believers, we are called out. We are called out of the world to serve God. And essentially, that's what God wanted to do with the children of Israel when they were in Egypt. That's essentially his purpose for calling Abraham in the book of Genesis. Abraham is called the father of faith. He is the first one to be called out from the world to serve God. And his seed, which is the children of Israel, right? He had a son Isaac, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot 12 sons of Israel. This is all right there in the book of Genesis. And then eventually, Jacob's son Joseph, as we all know the story, Joseph was sold into slavery by his other brothers, and this was the contact that Israel, the collective people, first made with Egypt, because Joseph was sold into Egypt. And it's a story that you wonder, well, why did that happen? A lot of the reason why it happened was so God could give us a picture and an example, right? As I said, types, figures, allegories. These are examples that God gave us so that we can understand our own Christian walk, right? So Joseph was sold into slavery. Therefore, Israel, through Joseph's seed and the 12 tribes, were essentially sold into slavery, because as we see at the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob and his sons went down and connected with Joseph, who became the ruler, or the de facto. That's probably not the right word. The essentially the head, the number one guy below Pharaoh. That's what Joseph became, right? Because we know this story that Joseph was imprisoned, and then he went and told Pharaoh his dream, and because of that, Pharaoh made him number one. Pharaoh made him his right-hand man. That's literally what happened right there in the book of Genesis. So the children of Israel were in Egypt, but yet they became slaves. As we see in the book of Exodus, they became slaves. So the metaphor there, the figure there, on this long tangent that I'm saying, is that God's people can become slaves in the world. Egypt is typified. Egypt's typology represents the world, right? The world, the cosmos, the world that's ruled by Satan. Pharaoh represents Satan. Pharaoh was a taskmaster. He was a harsh ruler over his slaves, and he would whip them and make them build bricks for his storehouses. That's a metaphor for what people in today's world are doing. Everybody out there is out serving money, serving, essentially paying rent, going to their work and their jobs in order to slave by. They don't call it slave wage, slave labor for nothing. It's literally satanic. The world is satanic. God wanted to call people out of that. That's a type and a figure of salvation. He calls them out. It's like Jesus says in Matthew. I'm not sure exactly where in Matthew right now, but he says, "Take my yoke upon me, for my burden is light, and my yoke is easy." Right? Well, what does that mean? It means the world is a harsh burden, right? The world is a harsh yoke, right? We have to carry this harsh yoke, and that was one of my favorite verses when I was coming back to God, because I was so stressed out. I was so burdened and downtrodden with the demands of the world before I became saved. And my experience while leaving the church and going into the world was that's what I experienced. I experienced slavery in the world. And that's one of the main things that I wanted to escape. And so that was one of the main things that God caught me with. He caught me with that verse. Um, you know, take my yoke upon me. I for my burden is light and my yoke is easy, and there you will find rest. And I have found rest in Christ. I found rest. Peace for my soul and rest. I've had a lot of suffering, but I've my testimony is that I've been restful in the Lord to whatever extent, and I found a lot of peace within Him. So that verse is true. So the main reason why I say all that is to let you know that I'm not just like somebody who is like, oh, come to this church because it's the best way because that's how I was raised. Like, no. I went out to the world and I experienced the world and I've experienced the church, and I'm telling you the church is for real. And I went to other churches as well. I played around in other churches. I went to prosperity gospel churches. I went to some churches that weren't so much in prosperity. They were a little more biblical, but they were still denominational. And then I've went to the local churches. Now you can Google what the term local churches means, and you'll probably come up with a guy named Witness Lee and Watchman Nee. And so now I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of background in essentially what I'm talking about. So the local church, its foundation is a you could say it's a company, but it's a business name called Living Stream Ministry. Because if you're a church, you have to have an LLC. You have to register as a business in order for you to function and purchase property and essentially function as a church. You have to do that legally. So it was founded in the 1920s by a guy named Watchman Nee, and there was no LLC then. There was no business name then. They just simply met in their homes. They were practicing the biblical way of meeting in their homes, which is essentially what we see in Paul's epistles. If you really read Paul's epistles and you understand that, oh, wait a minute, he's talking to the First Corinthians, First and Second Corinthians. Who's the recipient of those letters? Paul's epistles are essentially letters to different churches, and essentially, if you break it down, what is Corinthians? What does that mean? It's the people of Corinth. Corinth was a city in Europe, right? So you can Google the history of that. So First and Second Corinthians is written to the people of the city of Corinth, right? What do we have after First and Second Corinthians? We have what is it? I should know this. First, Second Corinthians. I think it's Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians. I believe. I should know that. That's so easy. Basic Bible knowledge, right? But anyway, let's say the Galatians, right? So the Galatians is the people of Galatia. Galatia was a city in Europe. Ephesians, it's to the people of Ephesus. Ephesus was a city in Europe. Colossians is a epistle written to the people of Colossae. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians is a an epistle written to the people of Philippi. Right? So these are people who were believers, called out ones, had received salvation, following Jesus, right? And they were essentially recipients of Paul's epistles. He was writing to these people. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there was no Episcopalians. There's no epistle to the Episcopalians. Paul wasn't writing to the Wesleyans or the Episcopalians or the Baptists. There was no names like that. It was simply the names were simply the names of the cities, right? So there's a principle there. There's a foundational principle there of how God wanted people to meet. So essentially this guy Watchman Nee, and you can Google it and you can get into his books and you can read his quotes and you can study his history, but essentially he was a Chinaman. And he was saved and trained by a woman named M.E. Barber, who was an American missionary in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I should say, because he was born in, I think, 1905 or around there. So American missionaries went to China to preach the gospel, and for a long time they were not received well at all. But essentially, some of them made some progress. And this one woman, M.E. Barber, she founded a sort of school for Christian boys, and she taught this young man named Watchman Nee, who was very gifted, very intelligent, and he was essentially raised up by the Lord to recover some things, recover some biblical truths. And he did a lot of reading and studying of past, theologians and biblical writers and things like that. And he sort of gleaned and recovered a lot of truths, and he also went on to see in the Bible a lot of truths, and he was extremely gifted in studying the Bible. So a lot of what I know and a lot of what I've studied in the last 15 years, since I was around 18, 19, coming into, actually that's probably my time is not my, yeah, 15 or so years around there. Anyway, I'm old, right? So a lot of what I studied was his writings, and his writings were based on things that he saw, in addition to theologians and Bible scholars that he himself studied. So the local church essentially, and again, you can Google what the local church is, you can Google what that means. They call it the local church movement, but it's really not a movement. It's really a recovery of the foundational truths. So the local church was started by Watchman Nee in the 1920s in China. He started meeting on that same principle. As I mentioned, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. These principle of how they were meeting together, which is simply one church, one city. The believers in one city were united. There was no thought of, oh, I'm a Baptist, I'm a Episcopalian, I'm this, I'm that. That all came later, which essentially was Satan's doing. Satan did that to divide and confuse the body of Christ. But essentially, if you read the epistles, it's very, very simple and clear. Well, these are the believers in Corinth. These are the believers in Colossae. These are the believers in Philippi, right? And they're essentially, that's it. You live in that city. You're a believer in that city. It's not confusing like, oh, I'm a Baptist. I'm a this. I'm a that. No, right? It's just one church, one city. But now, see, we have all these churches, and it's essentially divisive. It divides the children of God. It divides the believers. And Satan did that on purpose. He wants them to be divided, because if they're united, right? United we stand, right? If they're united, they're strong and they have strength, and they can defeat him. So what he did was he came in with all these denominations to divide the church. So the local church was started, or I should say recovered. The concept of the local church was recovered by Watchman Nee in the 1920s. So I wrote this out after I wrote you that email, and this is two reasons why the local church is right. One, the truths. Two, the ground of locality. So I'm going to explain. I'm going to break that down here. The local church was started by Watchman Nee in the 1920s in China. It's based on the recovery of the practice of biblical meeting, which is one church, one city. Again, this is how they met in all these cities that Paul was writing to. So it's the biblical foundational truth. Now, I didn't look up this verse. I should have, but I made this video and I didn't look it up. So there's a couple verses that I didn't look up, but you can Google yourself, or maybe I'll have to find them and email them to you if you really want to know. But it's biblical. Everything I'm saying is biblical based. So one church, one city is based. I believe it's First Kings. It might be Deuteronomy. I might be wrong. It might be Deuteronomy. Where God told the children of Israel that He wanted them to meet at a specific chosen place, and I believe it was North Judea. I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And the Old Testament is very deep, and it's very, like I said, allegorical types and figures, and it's hard to understand. And I'm blessed to have someone like Witness Lee who came and Watchman Nee who came and uncovered these deep truths. But there's a part in the Old Testament, I believe it's First Kings or it's in Deuteronomy. I'll have to look that up. It might be Joshua. It might be the book of Joshua. But it's around there. It's right there in the middle of the Old Testament. And God said He wanted, and again, northern Judea, so it's a specific place. God said He wanted them to meet at a chosen place. So that's a principle. It's very important that God's followers are not allowed to meet at the place of their choosing, but only at the place of God's choice. So there's a principle there that we can't just be willy-nilly and like, oh, let's just go meet here. Well, I like the Baptists because they're this, and
they really praise God, and it just makes my soul feel good to be with these guys, or I like the Lutherans because they meet this way, and that makes my soul feel. No, we can't. That's not the principle of the Bible. It has to be God's choice. But God's choice is the best choice, right? God's choice is the best choice for us, and that's usually that. What I just said there is a general principle about the Christian life. God's choice is always the best choice because God's heart towards us is always good, and when God gives us something, He gives us something good. Um, so He wants us to meet in a specific place of our choice, and you know, we can't just we have to meet in a biblical way. We have to meet in the correct biblical way. So what Watchman Nee uncovered was what he discovered was that the biblical way to meet was simply on the foundation of one church, one city. And I believe I always get this mixed up, but there's the foundation and the ground, and they're two different things. I think I have these backwards. I think the foundation is Christ, and the ground is one church, one city. There's a book by Witness Lee called The Genuine Ground of Oneness. It's a book that changed my life, a book that radically changed the way I understand the church, and I believe it was God. There's two books. One by Witness Lee called The Genuine Ground of Oneness. The other one by Watchman Nee called The Orthodoxy of the Church. Those are two books that I could not recommend any higher.
They absolutely changed my life. I discovered those books when I was 21, and they totally showed me these truths that I'm talking now, the foundation and the ground of the church. And they are different. The foundation, I believe, is Christ and his life, and the ground of the church is one church, one city. Meaning the way to meet is on the foundation of Christ, the way to come together with other believers, and the way to practice. And it is important that we come together with other believers. It's crucial, actually. If we're going to be a Christian, we can't be Lone Ranger Christians. We can't be by ourselves thinking that we're going to defeat the enemy. We need the body of Christ. We need the other believers. And it says, I believe in Hebrews, it says, do not forsake your assembling together. This is in the Bible. Do not forsake your assembling together, meaning don't stop going to church, right? And it's very solemn and serious, because when we stop and we're separated from the other believers, it's like a wolf who's trying to pick out the sheep, right? What's he looking for? He's looking for a lone sheep. He's looking for a sheep that's not connected to the other ones, because then he can just pick them off. And I've experienced that in my life. We need the body. Need the body. It's so important. We need the other believers, but we have to meet on the right ground, right? The other thing is, what Watchman Nee did was he recovered and uncovered deeper truths. So we have a Bible that's produced by Living Stream Ministry, which is our company, or our business name foundation, and it's called the Recovery Version, right? Um, the Recovery Version it is not the recovery of, like, recovering from alcohol or drugs. No, it's the recovery of deeper truths of the Bible, right? Particularly Christ living in us and out from us to be God's expression and representative on earth. This is called God's economy. God's economy is in Ephesians chapter 3 verse 9. It talks about the economy of the mystery, right? You can Google that. Ephesians chapter 3 verse 9. It says, to enlighten all what the economy of the mystery is. Well, it uses that word economy, and the New Testament was written mostly in Greek, Greek and Aramaic, but mostly in Greek. And the word economy in Ephesians 3:9, what that word means in Greek is ecclesiasta, or ecclesiastia, I think, and it means household arrangement. So God has an economy and a mystery which is very much linked to his household. Well, what is his household? The household is his body, the church. It's how he arranges the believers. In John, I'm sure you're familiar with this verse. In the book of John, he says, "My father, in my father's household there are many abodes." I'm sure you're familiar with that verse. Well, he's not talking about heaven. He's talking about God's arrangement on this earth today. There are many abodes. So God has many homes. And what are the homes? The homes are the believers. The homes are us, So the economy is very important, and that's one of the main deeper truths that Watchman and Witness Lee uncovered when they started to recover a lot of deep biblical truths. So the local church is based on that. It's based on the recovery of the deeper truths of the Bible, which is particularly Christ living in us and out from us to be God's expression and representative on earth. If we go back to Genesis chapter 2 or 3, when God created Adam and Eve, he said, let them bear my image and